Hi everyone. Today I want to cover how to deploy your Streamlit applications to Google Cloud Run and securing them so that they are only accessible by people within your organization. This can be done for the entire organization, for certain users within specific groups, or even at an individual account level. We're going to be walking through this in the Google Cloud Console, so we're not going to be using Terraform to do this. I want you to get a good understanding of all the steps involved, all the components involved, and how they interact with each other. There are going to be some things that I point out, some pitfalls that I ran into the first time I went through this, and I'll call this out so that you're aware of it. Normally these things happen when you don't read the documentation all the way through, or they are just a particular sentence in the documentation that doesn't make sense at that particular point in time. So I'll be calling these things out as the video progresses. Nothing we're going to cover here about securing Cloud Run services with Identity-Aware Proxy is specific to Streamlit. You can use exactly the same technique to secure any of your applications that you want to deploy to Cloud Run and make available within your organization to only those users in the organization, so no one external can access them. So let's get started. Right, so let's have a look at the components we're going to be working with today. So this is a very, very straightforward diagram. I've not added every single thing in here. I'm just highlighting the main components we need to be aware of as we try to deploy to Cloud Run and secure our applications to those users within our organization. So what will end up happening is that a user will make a request to your Cloud Run Streamlit application. That request will hit a load balancer that's placed in front of Cloud Run. The load balancer has got a set of components. It's got a front end, which is typically what ends up routing your request to a back end. That back end is actually what is secured by Identity-Aware Proxy. And that back end ends up going to a network endpoint group, which then is set up to forward that request to a particular Cloud Run instance, or rather, to use the parlance of Google Cloud, to a particular Cloud Run service that you've got. So keep in mind, we're going to be deploying things to Cloud Run as services, not as Cloud Run jobs. These are services that users interact with. Your front end will have a SSL certificate, so we're going to be able to access this via HTTPS. We will automatically have a redirect set up for us so that anyone that goes via HTTP will automatically be redirected to our HTTPS site. We will have a custom domain that we use for this. So imagine something along the lines of apps.yourdomain.com/your service, or just the actual subdomain, so apps.yourdomain.com. And you will then end up with that backend service being the thing that we secure with Identity-Aware Proxy. And this is an important thing to keep in mind. In the beginning, it's always tempting to think that it's the actual load balancer that is being secured via Identity-Aware Proxy, but it's not the load balancer itself, not the instance of the load balancer. It's the actual back end that you configure in the load balancer. Now, this becomes important because you can later on define multiple backends that go to different network endpoint groups with different apps or groups of apps running in Cloud Run services, and each backend being secured in a particular way. So you might have a backend for applications that's open to your entire organization. You might have then additional backends which are only accessible via certain Google groups, and then you could have other backends which are only accessible via a handful of individual user accounts. Now, the caveat here being, don't deploy things to individual user accounts. Always use Google Groups where possible. So keep that in mind, but you get the idea. It's the back end that's being secured, not the load balancer as a whole. So here we are in Google Cloud Console, and I've created a fresh project So nothing's been done to it other than create the project underneath my organization. Now you'll see that I've got a domain registered here. So I've gone and bought a domain for the purposes of making this video. When you're going to be going through this, either you need to have access to your own domain to do this, or you need to have access to the person who's able to set the DNS entries for your particular domain. Because what we will be doing is deploying our Streamlit applications to a subdomain, something like apps.experimase.com, and making sure that Google then generates an SSL certificate for us for that particular subdomain. So in order to do that, and this is one of the things that tripped me up when I went through this the first time, in order for that SSL certificate to be generated, and we'll get to that a bit later, Google needs you to add the A records that points to the load balancer instance that we create, and it doesn't generate the certificate until you have actually set that A record. So this project has got no APIs enabled. We're going to run into these things as we go along, and that's to show you what you would need to do. So there will be a few places here where things happen that I need to figure out, or that I need to talk a bit about or click through, and that's all part of the process to show you what ends up needing to happen as you step through this on your own. The first service that we need to enable for ourselves here is Artifact Registry. Artifact Registry is required so that we are able to push our Docker images that we build of our Streamlit apps to Artifact Registry, and then we are able to deploy those images as containers on Google Cloud Run services or as Google Cloud Run services. So in the past, people have used Container Registry. You could still use Container Registry, but the focus has been to move a lot of that container-based workload to Artifact Registry instead. So we're going to go ahead now and enable Artifact Registry for our project. So here we go, the first API that we need to enable, and that is for Artifact Registry. So I'm just going to click on that and let that run so that it creates the Artifact Registry or enables the Artifact Registry API for us, after which it's going to take us to the interface through which we can create our Docker registry on this instance of Artifact Registry. Now we can go ahead and click on Create Repository here, and we want to create a Docker repository. So I'm going to call it Streamlit, and I'm going to choose a region. I'll choose one that's closer to me, something like Europe West 1. I'm leaving everything else as is, and I'm going to click on Create. So that's going to create the Docker registry to which we can push all of our Streamlit applications. Next up, I want to go and have a look to see whether Identity-Aware Proxy is enabled for this project. So let's go off to the side onto our navigation menu, down to Security, and there you'll see Identity-Aware Proxy. So I'm going to select that, click on Enable API. And let's just wait for that to enable the Identity-Aware Proxy API for us. Great. Now that that's enabled, we can go to our Identity-Aware Proxy, where it's going to ask us to configure a OAuth consent screen. So we can have one OAuth consent screen per Google Cloud project. And what we want to do now is go and configure that consent screen so that we've got this all set up and ready to use with our load balancer. Click on Configure Consent Screen. And in here, you've got a couple of options. You can either make this an internal application, so you can see that that is something that's limited to your Google Workspace or users within your organization. And that's what we want to be using here. We're not going to be turning this application loose onto the world. For that, you would need to actually use your external consent screen. So we're going to use internal. We're going to click Create. We're going to give this app a name, and we're going to call this Streamlit. Your user support email is an email that needs to be configured. It's someone within the organization, or it's an actual email address within your organization. So make sure that you either have a user there or have a account registered for support, so it can also be a group. So I'm just going to go ahead and work with the user that I've got for this. I'm not going to bother with any of the app logos or domains or anything like this. And you also need to be able to put in a developer contact. And this is going to be, again, my user that I've set up for this. Right, so we're going to save and continue with that. And over here, we're not going to do anything with scopes. We're going to leave that as is. We're going to click through to save and continue. Here's your summary of your OAuth consent screen, and everything seems to be good. So we're going to head back to the dashboard. So you can go ahead and edit that later if you need to make any changes to it. But for now, this is what we're going to run with during this demo. Let's go and enable Cloud Load Balancer so that we have got that particular component ready to go as well. So let me just clean up a bit up here. Let's get rid of our overview. I'm back on the Identity-Aware Proxy side of things, so I'm going to refresh that. And now you should see that Identity-Aware Proxy is giving us a different screen to the one we saw previously. So this is all up and running, and that's been configured, and this is where we will come and secure our application later. Let's first look at our networking services. So let's go to networking services. Yeah, I'm just going to pin that. And let's go to load balancing. And now you're going to see errors like this, and they are very much not descriptive. So what's happening here is that we have got a couple of APIs not enabled. So the first one we need to go and look for is if I go to our API services that we had over here on the OAuth consent side, let's go and have a look at what's enabled. And you'll see that Identity-Aware Proxy has now been enabled, but we are missing Compute Engine, because Compute Engine is what we need in order to actually make use of a lot of the compute and networking functionality. We need to go and enable that. So let's go and search for Compute Engine API. Click on that and enable it. So that's now done. Let's go back to our load balancing tab. Let's refresh that and let's see if we get the same error. And you can now see that that error has gone. So I'm just going to click on create load balancer. I'm not going to set this up now. I just want to make sure that we've actually got everything we need. Everything looks all right. And now we can move on to our next component, service accounts. Everyone's favorite topic. So in order to deploy this correctly, I want to make sure that we actually deploy each one of our Cloud Run services with their own service account. That's important to make sure that you've got complete control over how that Cloud Run service can access other resources. So you don't want them to run under the default service account. You want them to run under a specific service account so that you can restrict which services a particular Cloud Run service can access. And this becomes important later on when you want to do things like give a Cloud Run service access to Google Cloud Secret Manager to populate environment variables from secrets that you store there, or give a Cloud Run service access to a backend database, as an example. Now, we're talking in the realms of Streamlit here, but those things can actually be quite useful as well for your Streamlit applications. So let's go off and create ourselves a example service account, or a service account that we'll use with our application. So I'm going to go into IAM. I'm going to go to service accounts. I'll see that we've got the Compute Engine service account up and running here. We don't want to use that for our stuff. We will call this Streamlit Demo. So we'll deploy the first Streamlit app, will be called our Streamlit Demo service. And I'm just going to go ahead and not give it any roles or anything like that for now. Let's just create that service account. We can later configure all of this when we need to. Right. So there's our Streamlit demo. Note that I'm not downloading a JSON key file for this particular service account. We don't want to do that. We want to stay away from having key files. So we want to actually run our Cloud Run service with the service account, and anything that we deploy into that service ends up authenticating to the rest of Google Cloud with the service account under which it will be running. Next up, we need to make sure that we can actually deploy from Docker to Artifact Registry. So we've got a service account up and running here. The next thing we need to do is go and make sure that we are ready to actually push some containers. So I'm going to go back to Artifact Registry. And inside our repository, you can see that we've got some setup instructions here. So you can go through the documentation here that tells you how to go about and deploy and push to Artifact Registry. What I'm going to do now is actually copy this that we've got over here, which is our auth that we need to do. And I'm going to run that in the terminal. So let's go ahead and authorize things to work for us. That all looks good to me. So you want to continue, say yes. Fantastic stuff. So that should do the authorization that we need in order to have our Docker desktop client push out to Artifact Registry. Let's look at our Streamlit application that we will be deploying. So this is the stock standard Streamlit demo app. There's nothing fancy about it. It makes no connections to anything, nothing Google specific. This is just being used to show that our authentication that we're setting is actually working. What we need to look at here is our Docker file. So very important to define this port environment variable, because that is what Cloud Run will use to actually specify to your container that's being run by a Cloud Run service which port it needs to be listening on. So if you just set this to 8080 by default and you don't actually expose it and use that port to set the server port on your Streamlit app, as you can see here in our entry point where we're running the Streamlit application, then further down the line, if Cloud Run or if a change is made via Cloud Run to specify a different port to listen on, then it's not going to filter through and your container, your service in Cloud Run is not going to work correctly. The default port that Cloud Run uses happens to be 8080, so that's why you'll get some success if you just set it to 8080, but that's just make sure that things are configurable and you're actually taking full advantage of what the tooling offers. So the next thing we want to do is we actually want to look at how we end up packaging this and deploying that to Artifact Registry. So that's the next step in what we are doing here. Let's go ahead and push this particular application to Artifact Registry. So we are going to containerize this and then push this up to Artifact Registry. I'm going to copy the command that I'm going to use for this over, and then we'll break that down and look at the different components of it. The first bit of this command that will probably look a little bit different depends on what machine you're running on. So I'm doing a specific build for Linux AMD 64 platform, and that's because I'm running on an M1 Mac, which has got an ARM-based CPU. So if I was to omit this particular platform build bit, so if I wasn't using build X, you typically use Docker build and then a -t and what you want to tag the image with. If you don't include this platform specific bit that I've got there, then you'll push your image up to Artifact Registry, you'll deploy it to Cloud Run, and it'll just fail. The moment that a Cloud Run service starts up, it will fail. And that's because it expects an AMD 64, a typical normal x86 64-bit architecture, an image that's built for that particular architecture. The next bit that we need to look at in the URL here, or rather the command that we've got here, is the first bit here, which is our location that we are actually tagging this with. So this is our location of where that Docker registry is that we've created an artifact registry. So that's the location bit here. We know it's a Docker registry that we created. So that's why that's Docker there. And then you add your project ID. So important, not the project name, but the actual project ID, which you, both of these things you'll get from Google Cloud Console. Then it's the name of the registry that you created, so Streamlit, and then the name of the actual that you want to give the actual image. So I'm going to tag this as demo, and I'm just giving it the tag here of latest. So every time that I build this, I can refer to the latest tag. That's just what I'm doing here. You can go ahead and version it, do whatever you like with it. And here I've got just a period there to say I want to build things that are in the current folder that I'm in. So I'm going to hit that, run that command, and that should build and tag the image for us, which is the first step in deploying it. So next up is deploying that image that we've just created. We'll just pop this command in here. So it's just doing a Docker push to that image, the tag that we've provided that image with. And this ends up taking our image and pushing it up to Artifact Registry. Going back to Artifact Registry on the Cloud Console, I'm just going to refresh this page here. You should see that we've got the container called demo there, and there it is. That's just been pushed up now. Cool. So this will allow us to now start configuring a Cloud Run service. We'll talk a bit about that. So let's go over to Cloud Run. And in here, we want to say create a new service. Now, notice I'm not actually starting things up from the App Engine and load balancer side. I need to actually create my Cloud Run service first, and then I will create the load balancer and Identity-Aware Proxy. The reason for that is that we'll end up creating a network endpoint group where I will need to select the service that I want to run this, that needs to be run the moment that we hit our endpoint. This is only the case if you are specifying that you want to run a specific Cloud Run service behind a particular network endpoint group. So we'll cover what we could do in order to use URL mapping to allow us to have a whole bunch of services that we run. And we'll talk about that later on. So I'm going to say create my service. It's busy enabling the Cloud Run admin API for me, so that's off doing its thing. But while that's doing it, we will go ahead and we will select our image URL. So you can see it's either container registry or artifact registry. There we go. That's the instance we're after. We're going to demo, which is the container that we've pushed up, and we're selecting a specific version of that container. So we've selected that. I want to deploy this in the same region as where I've currently got things set up for my artifact registry. So I'm going to go and put that in Europe West 1, specifying that CPU is only allocated during the request processing. I'm not messing with any of these things. We're going to change things later on. So I want to first see that this is actually working. And then after we've done that, we'll go and change the settings on it to lock things out to make sure that you can only get to it via our load balancer and Identity-Aware Proxy. So one thing I do want to do is drop down on our container and network services here. And I want to look for, it's not there, secrets, nope, apologies. Let's go up, let's look at our networking. And there we are, session affinity. This is really important. Session affinity is used when you are actually trying to make sure that a web request that is sent to a Cloud Run service ends up being served by the same instance of that service, so the same container that's running behind the scenes. And that's very important for Streamlit. So not that important for other REST-based endpoints and APIs and web apps that you create, but for Streamlit, it's very important because Streamlit uses WebSockets. So in order to make sure that you don't end up with random Streamlit errors, you need to make sure that you tick session affinity there. The next thing we want to do is security. We want to say that this thing should not run under the Compute Engine default service account. We want to go and select our Streamlit demo service account. And once we've got those selected, we can click on Create. And let's just quickly check what error we've got here. We need to select the way that we want authentication to work here. So for now, I'm going to say that I want to allow unauthenticated invocation. So I'm selecting that and we click on Create, which will now create our Cloud Run service for us. So let's see whether this all runs through without any errors. That deployment finished successfully. So let's go and navigate to this URL that you see here at the top to see what our application looks like. So I'm just popping that in there. And off you go. There we go. There's our Streamlit app. So we can now go ahead and start on the next phase of our deployment, which is to set up our cloud load balancer. Before we go ahead and set up our cloud load balancer, let's quickly go ahead and secure this application to just show that you won't be able to get to it without the load balancer. What we want to do is we want to go to our networking tab over here. We want to specify that the ingress controls go to for internal ingress and that we only want to allow external traffic from application load balancers. So go ahead and save that. And then once that is updated, we're going to move on to the security tab over here to specify that we don't want to allow unauthenticated invocations. So we want to say that that should be required. So we'll save that. If we copy this URL again and paste it into our browser, you'll see that the page can now not be found. So we've now secured the application and we can go ahead and set up our cloud load balancer to allow us to get to it, and we'll set up the authentication via Identity-Aware Proxy. So let's close this down and then let's navigate to networking services and go to our load balancing. To create our load balancer, we're just clicking on create load balancer over here. What we want to deploy is an application load balancer. So we're going to start the configuration for that. We want to say that this is for internet facing. So we want to make sure that we've got from internet to my VMs or serverless services. And we are going to use the global external application load balancer. The reason for that is that the classic load balancer was the classic and that they've made a bunch of improvements when going for the new global external application load balancer. And the regional external application load balancer, the reason why we're not choosing that is because that doesn't support Google creating your SSL certificates for you. So we want to make sure that the SSL certificates are handled by Google. So we're going to choose these options. Click on continue. And now we need to start configuring things. So I'm going to give this load balancer a name. I'll just go with something like LB Streamlit. I want to create a new front end. And I want to say that my protocol here is HTTPS. Important here is I want to create an IP address. So I don't want an ephemeral IP address. I want to create one. I'm going to say LB Streamlit IP. And this is going to give us a static IP address that we will use to set up the DNS records for in the DNS of our domain that we're going to be using. So in here, choosing port 443. The certificate, you want to say that you want to create a new certificate. in here, let's go with LB Streamlit. I want Google to manage that certificate. And this is very important, the domain that you're going to be using. So when Google manages your SSL certificate, it doesn't allow wildcard domains or sort of top level domains that certificates that cover any subdomains that you create. Those you need to go off and have procured via one of the other providers of SSL certificates. For Google's SSL certificates, you need a subdomain or the actual top level domain specified here. So because I want to go ahead and secure this with apps.experimaze.com, this is what I need to put in here. So I'm creating that. Now keep in mind, this certificate is not going to be issued until such time as I make the A record entry in the DNS. So this is very important because this is one of the things that tripped me up. I created it, didn't get the A records set up immediately, and I kept on seeing that it's just in the provisioning state. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We want to enable an HTTP to HTTPS redirect. And we're going to say done on that. So that's our front end created. And now we're going to move on to the back end configuration. In here, I want to say that I want to create a new back end service, not a back end bucket. I'm going to call this the LB Streamlit backend. I want to say that the type that I'm going to be using here is a serverless network endpoint group. So you can see that's what we need in order to go against things like App Engine, Cloud Run, and Cloud Functions. Then I want to select the serverless network endpoint groups. So I want to actually create that particular endpoint group for me. So I'm going to click on create. And this is going to be my neg. I'm going to choose the region, which is the one in which my Cloud Run service is running. So Belgium West 1, I'm going to say Cloud Run, and I'm going to select that service that I've created. Now this is an important bit, and we'll cover that towards the end of this, but this is where we could, for example, use a URL mask to deploy multiple Cloud Run services that all have a URL mask applied to redirect the backend or the network endpoint group to a specific service just by changing our URL. But for now, we're going to go ahead and just deploy to that specific service that we've created. So I'm going to click on create. We don't want to currently use Cloud CDN for this, so we'll disable that. You do want to enable logging. So if there's any errors that come up, you want to be able to see them in the log. So that's very important. And in here, you can just leave those blank for now. It's going to go off and create the default Cloud Armor stuff for us. So we click on create, hit OK. We want to move over to our routing rules. And in here, we just keep that to our simple host and path rules. So you can see there that all of the requests coming into this load balancer is going to go against this particular backend that we've created. So now we can click on review and finalize. It's going to give all of our information for us. And we click on create to create this load balancer. So that goes off and provisions the load balancer for us. Once the load balancer is provisioned, we want to go into the load balancer to go look at that IP address that it's running against. You'll see here that we've got our IP and our port. This is important. We need to capture that or copy that out. And we now need to go set up the A record in the DNS entries for our domain. So copy that out and let me show you. The A record needs to look something like this. So you end up with an A record. It will be apps experimase.com, and you want to map it to that URL. That's what you want to do within the DNS for your domain. So you go ahead and do that now. This is something that will differ depending on which DNS interface you've got for your domain. So have a look at the documentation for your particular provider, your registrar, or send this over to the person that is responsible for setting that within your organization. Back in our Google Cloud Console, we can go to this particular certificate here. So if I click on that, you can have a look at the status, and that is currently showing as provisioning. So I've made the A record entry in my DNS for my domain, and this status should show that it's provisioned when it's all ready to go. So this can take some time. Be patient. Come back, check it out. It ranges. As you can see, they specify that you shouldn't contact them if it's not been at least 24 hours. I've typically experienced this taking between a couple of minutes and up to an hour, has been my experience. But if you've got the A record created in your DNS, then this shouldn't be much of a problem. While that is provisioning, we can go ahead and work with Identity-Aware Proxy. So we'll head over here to Security, all the way down to the bottom to our Identity-Aware Proxy. And in here, you should now see some options for us. So you can see there's an error there, or it's giving us an error status. That just means we need to enable Identity-Aware Proxy for this particular load balancer backend. So you can see it's the backend services that are getting protected. So we're going to enable that, specify that we've read the agreement, and we want to turn things on. So next up, we need to go and grant some permissions. So we want to go and add a principal here. And this is going to look maybe a little bit weird, but we'll go with the domain. And that will be the principal that we will be securing. So we're going to go with Cloud IAP, and we want to give this particular principal the IAP secured web app user role. Anyone that needs to be able to authenticate and get through to that backend service would need to have this role on this particular backend service here set. So we'll do that. And that will go ahead and allow anyone that's got an experimase.com email address to now be able to authenticate through to this backend service. Now, we're not done yet with providing access to service accounts. What we need to do is we also need to go and provide access to the Cloud IAP, so Identity-Aware Proxy service account, to have the ability to invoke the Cloud Run service that we've set up. Now that's going to take the form of a service account that looks something like this. So servers hyphen your project number, and then GCP hyphen SA hyphen IAP for Identity-Aware Proxy. Now the project number we can get from our Google Cloud Console. So I'll jump back into the Cloud Console, and over here, if you go onto your menu to the dashboard, you'll see that the project number is actually displayed there. So we're going to copy that out. Let's go back to where we were in our project here, paste that in, and now we've got that email address ready to go. So let's get back into Identity-Aware Proxy. Let's go to Cloud Run. We'll select that Cloud Run service. And what we want to do is add a principal here. So paste that in, you'll see that it automatically comes up. And you want to say that this is a Cloud Run invoker role that you give that service account. So this allows that service account to start this particular Cloud Run service. It's a good idea to not provide that permission across the board for the entire project. You want to keep things as granular as possible. and only grant access to do these things like invoke a Cloud Run service for the actual services that you want IAP to be able to start. Let's have a look at how the certificate that we asked to get provisioned is doing. So we'll go to our load balancer, and then on the load balancer, go to the certificate. And we can see that certificate is provisioned. It's now active. So let's go ahead and navigate to our domain. So apps.experimaze.com. And you can see that's our Streamlit app that's up and running. If I was now to go and do this with a incognito window, so a user that's not yet signed in, we can actually have a look and see what that's going to do for us. So if we go there, you'll see that we actually get challenged. And when I'm logging in here, let's see what that will do. Using two-factor authentication, and only after you've successfully logged in do you have access to the Streamlit application. Now, earlier on, I made mention of the fact that you can actually use URL mapping on your network endpoint groups to allow you to deploy a whole bunch of Cloud Run services, so Streamlit apps to Cloud Run, and then not have to set up individual backends for all of them. So just be able to reach it from a URL. So we're going to look at how we do this. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to actually go and modify the Streamlit apps that we actually deploy. I'll show you the main thing that we need to do, or the only thing that we actually need to do, is go into our Docker file and add this particular setting to our Streamlit app when we run it. So we need to set the base URL path. The reason for that is when you launch Streamlit in the container, it's actually starting up a web server. And if you want to access your application at the URL of apps.experimaze.com/demo, at the moment, all we're doing is we're going to apps.experimaze.com and it runs the demo Cloud Run service behind the scenes for us. But if you want to reach that particular service by its name, you need to actually set this base URL path. Otherwise, you end up with a Streamlit app that doesn't serve the actual application because it's waiting and serving from the base URL, which would just be your root path. So this is the first thing that you need to do, and the only thing that you need to do on the app itself. So I've gone ahead and actually pushed that up. So I've made that change already. And then the next thing we do is we actually get to go into Cloud Run again, and we need to create a new revision for it. So we've got this particular one running there. Remember when we created this, it was done against a specific image. So we need to go and select a new image now, the latest version of that. So we go down, you'll see that I've got another app that I've pushed up just so that we've got access to something else to deploy as well. So this is now the latest app there. So we can select that. Well, that's the latest image. And we should be able to just go ahead and say deploy. So that's going to create a new revision for us. So that will become active, and that will become the Cloud Run instance that actually serves your application when you go to your URL. Now, when we've done this, the moment we've done this, we'll end up with this application not behaving correctly. So we'll see what that looks like in a moment, because I believe that's sort of similar to what you're going to see if you didn't set that base URL path. So that's gone live, so that's busy, right. So if we now refresh this app, you've got 404 not found. So it's not behaving correctly. And we'll go ahead and fix that soon. But just before we do that, let's actually create another service, which is that uploader that I talked about. And that's just another Streamlit application that we can use to show how this is all going to work when it's finished. So pretty much similar stuff. This time we set all of these things on here. we want to go to session affinity. And the one thing we've not done is actually create a service account for it. So we want to create another service account. We'll call that Streamlit Uploader. We'll provision that. Okay, let's double check this. Ingress controls are set, authentication set. We've got a service account for it. On the networking side, we've got session affinity selected. Everything is looking good. So we're going to go ahead and create that. So let's wait for this to finish. And once this is finished, remember we also need to give the Identity-Aware Proxy invoker privileges on this particular service as well. Otherwise, it won't be able to start this, invoke this Cloud Run service to serve your requests at your URL. So that's finished deploying. So let's go out and let's set our permissions on this. So for uploader, have a look at the permissions, add in here, remember that service account that we wanted. If I remember correctly, actually, let's go and have a look at the demo one. There we go. This is what we want. So we copy that. Let's add that in. Right, so now Cloud Identity Access, now Identity-Aware Proxy has got the ability to invoke this Cloud Run service. But you'll see the same thing that's going on here is going to happen. We've only got a particular network endpoint group set up that's going against our original demo Cloud Run service. So let's now go and change the network endpoint group to not point to a specific Cloud Run service, but allow us to actually use our names of the services in the URL to point to a specific one. So we'll go to our load balancer. We'll edit the load balancer. We'll go to our backends, edit this particular backend, and then in here say that we want to create a new serverless network endpoint group. And we'll go with Streamlit URL map network endpoint group. Changing this again to Europe West 1. We want to say Cloud Run, and this time we don't want to select a specific service. We want to say URL mask. So what we want to do here is we just want to say /service, and we want to create that. Click on done. Everything else stays the same, and we update this. And click on update here on the load balancer, and this is busy changing that network endpoint group. So the new one will allow us to actually point in our URL to a specific Cloud Run service. So you can already see how we've now given everyone within our organization access to pretty much all of the Cloud Run services sitting behind this particular backend. So once those changes have taken effect, we can now go off and try it out. So if we go to apps.experimase.com, it should give us a 404 not found. There's nothing there. We didn't specify the name of a service, and we need to specify a name of the service in order to redirect our request to a specific Cloud Run service that we've got. So if we do demo, that should now spin up our demo service. And if we go to the uploader, then that will spin up the uploader. So that's how you can use URL masks on the network endpoint group to allow you to deploy multiple apps, all secured with the same level of permissions using Identity-Aware Proxy. And that brings us to the end of the work we need to do to secure our applications deployed on Cloud Run with Identity-Aware Proxy. There's a whole load more that one can get into, like URL mapping or different routes to different backends, but we'll save that for another video. Hope you enjoyed it.